Welcome back to the Crux of the Matter. I'm Landen Connor here with Riley Stansberry and our special guest star, Ella Kuenzli. Did I get that name right?
Unfortunately not. It's Kuenzli. Just pretend the U isn't there, but
Okay.
you were close.
Awesome. Ella Kuenzli here for a very special topic on a modern topic. Not controversial at all, you know? It's going to be feminism. So if you watched the title and you clicked on this, you already know. But we're going to be kind of covering the entire question, does modern feminism actually help women? You probably have some predispositions towards this question. You might feel like we're already misogynistic here, but we want you to really just start with an open mind and get to learn a few different perspectives. We have a very, very diverse cast here of 3 young Gen Z individuals. So this will be a fun discussion, and stick with us as we cover histories, as we cover 4 waves of feminism, as we cover other topics, definitions, different ideologies that have extended beyond feminism, postmodern thought, and why it matters in the first place. So with that, I'll introduce Ella. Ella, tell us a little about yourself. You're a political science major, right? What does that mean?
Yes, I am. So I don't exactly know what political science is. It's kind of like, it's just a bit of a fun thing for me. I've always enjoyed politics and having discussions with my parents, so I thought that, that's probably a good sign. I do want to go to law school, so political science is kind of on that pathway, but I think it's also just very good for people to talk about ideas and that type of stuff. Talking about modern politics. Montana State politics is my favorite class by far because all we do is talk about modern politics and what's going on in today in Montana, which I love.
So 2 law students in the room right now. Oh, this could be a debate worth waiting for. Yeah. But yeah, we live in a great area for it, right next to the Capitol, about a mile away. So yeah, I'm glad you chose Carol, and I'm glad you're here.
No tailors, though. They got a bunch of lawyers and senators here. No tailors in town. I had to drive 2.5 hours away to get my suit. Whatever.
See, you got to blame the patriarchy, apparently, in this video.
It's their fault. Patriarchy didn't want me to look dapper.
So yeah, I like to start off with definitions. So because we're covering feminism, let's start with the definition by the Cambridge Dictionary, which is, and I quote, "The belief that women should be allowed the same rights, power, and opportunities as men and be treated in the same way or the set of activities intended to achieve this state." End quote. That first definition, very broad, very definition-like. It's something that I definitely more agree with than the second definition, which we'll be mentioning shortly. But Riley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think the only stipulation you'd have to add with feminism is that it's a social and cultural phenomenon as a movement, and I think it's important to define sort of where feminism comes from, because we all know feminism's not there in ancient Rome. There's no feminist thought before. Really, there's little bits and pieces in the 16 and 1700s, but feminism really gets underway in the latter half of the 19th century and the late 1800s. So I think it'd be also helpful to define it to a time and place, because that's where it comes from.
Okay. I'd say as a counterpoint, some scholars would try to argue Roman era has some feminist thinkers, but yeah, classically defined, not really.
Yeah, I think that's modern academics projecting their worldview back into the past. I don't think it's there.
Yeah, fair enough. That's good. Ella, what about you? Do you think this definition is what you think of when you think of feminism? Does it kind of just project something out that's a little different?
Well, the first thing that I think about feminism, and I don't know if it really goes with the definition, but I kind of cringe a little bit because feminism, the word has been turned into this oh gosh, bra burning type of a thing, and it's just the first thing that I hear, I'm just oh, feminism. But I mean, I think with the definition, I think like you said, it's very broad. I think it makes sense. It's valid.
Okay. Because, yeah, just reiterating, same rights, power, and opportunities. I think the order is very telling because often you remember the first and last and forget the middle, which very curiously they put power in the middle, which, as we're probably going to be mentioning further, power seems to be playing an ever-increasing role in what equality, so-called, means. And so, yeah, kind of interesting there. And I guess I'll continue on to the next definition, which is by IWDA, an organization for women's rights, which is saying that feminism is about all genders having equal rights and opportunities. That opens a can of worms, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
last time I checked, all means more than two. Yeah, so obviously this is a little bit more of a modern definition. When they're saying all genders, they're talking about, well, gender and sex are two different things, and everyone's born with a biological sex, et cetera, et cetera. There's 56 billion genders, and all of those should have equal rights and opportunities, which kind of drives against the root word of, feminism, feminine, as opposed to masculine, which means it's a binary, there are two roles. And so saying all genders, does that undercut feminism? I think so, but I also think, as we'll get into later in this episode, that a lot of the modern sexual movements actually have the exact same premise as first wave feminism. But we'll get to that later. A little nugget for later.
Kind of cyclical back to the first wave, you think?
I think that the premise that first wave feminism is built on is the exact same premise that, say, transgenderism is built on.
Okay, so stay tuned for when we discuss first wave feminism. I see. And Ella, when you hear all genders having equal rights and opportunities, do you think that undermines women's specific role in feminism by really saying, okay, maybe it's not just women, but it's just everyone that's not men? Or do you still think it applies to women here?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna have to agree with Riley on this one. The whole all genders, I think it definitely undercuts the whole feminine part of feminism. If you say all genders, I don't know if this is a good example, but it was like the whole against black, or going against Black Lives Matter. It was like, well, all lives matter, that type of a thing. I think it's kind of similar to this all genders have equal rights and opportunities. It's kind of like you're taking away the point of it a little bit.
Oh, that is an interesting, correlation. Okay, so kind of it's an opposing force then, which in a way it's not really supporting feminism if they're trying to say like all genders trying to shift the block. It's almost feminism that's become a negative connotation in a way where they're trying to change it. Possibly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with the definitions kind of set as the ground level, we can now discuss really why that matters. And so I think the first question that came to my mind was really, what is feminism in our day-to-day lives? Is it really just trying to achieve equality with men? So as an athlete myself, I think of sports. Does feminism mean that women should have the same competitive abilities as men? Well, biologically, that's a negative. Does it mean that they're going to be competing in the same events? Well, mostly. And Title IX as a whole, you have now sports completely kind of equal balance throughout schools. And so Carroll is a Title IX school, and that plays out in how we have equal numbers of men's and women's sports teams. So although the level at which they play is different, the opportunity to play is not at question. And that's something which was established in 1972, and it's something which I think definitely plays into the definition of providing equal opportunity, which I personally have a little more agreement with from a freedom of expression or freedom of kind of those passions in a society, which Riley might disagree more, because it might be a slippery slope. Does offering those abilities take away from the natural roles that maybe women used to play?
Yeah, I think their feminism rose in opposition to, let's just call it vaguely, let's just say traditionalism. And to summarize, traditionalism is men and women are different and complementary. Very straightforward statement. And feminism is the idea that men and women are totally equal. So this kind of plays back into our episode 8 discussion, which if you haven't listened, you should listen to it. Reagan Fusionism and its consequences for modern conservatism. Is that the title? Did I get every word?
Ooh, that might be.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's good. I'm pretty sure I got every word. But this kind of plays back into our quandary that we were talking about in the 8th episode, which is that we were talking about this idea of the ratchet, and basically when movements happen, what the left does is the left brings in a new idea, and they fight and fight and fight for that idea, and the right fights against them. But the moment the left gets a win, the right will start defending it as if it was a value. So prime example, gay marriage. And even in 2012, California Proposition 8 or Proposition 6,
Yeah,
Proposition 8, even California, the bluest state in the union, voted against, the population voted against legalizing gay marriage. 2 years later, Obergefell got passed by the Supreme Court. Now, in 2024, even on the right, even on the farther parts of the right, even at the Daily Wire or something, or TPUSA, it would be hard to come out and say, no, I don't think gay marriage should exist. So this concept is basically progressives push and push and push, and once they get a win, conservatives will defend it, which hence the old axiom of G.K. Chesterton, which is the business of progressives is to go on making mistakes, and the business of conservatives is to stop the mistakes from being corrected. Or Michael Malice has another great quote, which is, all conservatives have conserved are the accomplishments of Woodrow Wilson.
That's a pretty devastating description of conservatism as a whole, which, we previously discussed. We want to be not only a party of reaction, but to actually be creation too. So it's a question: does instituting things like Title IX open up a larger discussion for saying, okay, now there's no differences between men and women? The intention, I don't think, was there for some, but the question is, does it transcend into this whole transgender debate we're having today over men's and women's sports? To not mention names, we have swimmers, we have track athletes, we have other players absolutely destroying the competition because they have some sort of an advantage. And so from a biological standpoint, that may have started with Title IX, and it's in some capacity they're related, you might argue. Is that what you're trying to get at with how it can be taken by the progressive left? Or is it just another thing?
I think you have to go before 1972 to find out, how we got to transgenderism. And I think the original feminine impulse was that women should be able to work in the workplace, as in it's an expression of higher culture. And there are people who, in the very, very beginning of feminism, were warning against it and saying it's going to lead to all these other things, some of which were apocalyptic level predictions and some of which were really, really accurate. But I think that the original premise that men and women are fundamentally equal, meaning, okay, I'm not talking about, as a theological statement, equal is not value. That's not what it is. And sometimes there's sort of a Mott and Bailey where we say equal and we mean that value is the same as, role, which is not what the historical position has been. You can go to people in like secular philosophy like Aristotle, who, as much as he wrote really great stuff about hierarchy and nature and everything like that, saying that men are better than women, I don't think that's true. I think even you can't defend that from a theological position. But if you're saying that men are different from women and perform different roles, then that is really the historic traditional position of the Christian West, because the West has been, in history, the most Christianized area of the world, probably, at least at a large scale, that's the historical position of traditionalism. And so when you get to feminism, which is saying that women can perform the exact same job in the workplace that men can perform, what you're saying is that men can perform a women's role culturally. But if you just cut that last bit off, men can perform a women's role, what do you start getting? You start getting gay marriage, and then you get sexually. Well, actually, it's not just that men and women are interchangeable, it becomes that men can become women and women can become men. Now, biologically, obviously, that's incorrect. But what I'm saying is the philosophical premise of both first wave feminism and modern transgenderism is the exact same.
Right. The actions have consequences and ideas have consequences, purpose. Okay. Which, I think can extend into the very multivariable factors. Say World War II, women had to enter the workforce. A lot of them didn't want to leave. We return to this. But I think taking a backtrack to the first wave of feminism, maybe let's just start there and see where that takes us. So besides what we earlier discussed, perhaps there were a few thinkers of a feminist train of thought back during the early periods of like the first century, even before. But we're going to start at late 1700s, early 1800s with the U.S. founding, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and all men are created equal. Specifically all men. We've kind of brought in that definition to saying all men and women are created equal, whether that was the original intention is hard to say for sure. But what we do know is that Abigail Adams in 1776 wrote a letter to her husband saying to not forget the ladies. It was to remember the ladies. And she said, and I quote, "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." And as we see Virginia Woolf and Mary Stanton, I forget her full name.
Elizabeth.
Cady Stanton?
Cady Stanton.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm combining two.
Yeah.
As we see the kind of thought of that, there is this impending fear of the scientific world, where even Mary Shelley with Frankenstein was saying, okay, the woman is becoming obsolete with science. Perhaps they could create artificial wombs. There's like reproductive questions here. And then we don't need women. And then so there was this fear of, okay, so men are tyrants, and so they're going to want to oppress or suppress us if possible. So remember us, give us our rights up front, and then we won't have to be fearful as much. So perhaps that was Abigail Adams' thought process in a bit. But then we see the first wave. And so this comes in the 1800s to 1900s with industrialization. And so you can see with some of the greatest highs, we also have some of the lowest lows. With good comes bad. And we see industrialization, the Lowell girls in Massachusetts got work. We see the focus on suffrage for the first time, so women trying to get the right to vote, and just other, popular social issues of the time, which were very transforming. And to think of both your opinions on first wave feminism, what do we think of its general consensus? Do we think, because Riley, you just said that first wave is kind of repeating itself and is leading to the current situation. Ella, do you think that first wave is what you agree with as a whole? Because the focus on suffrage, industrialization, women's ability to work in general society.
I mean, it's hard because I am a female, so I'm like,
Right.
yeah, I do enjoy the right to vote, you know? So I have a general consensus that, like, I do like the first wave, the fact that, you know, females were actually able to, you know, hold an industrial job. Not everyone wanted to, but it was like, I guess the opportunity to vote. Maybe you didn't want to, but just like that opportunity, I guess. I mean, I love that I can vote now, so I'm gonna have to say kudos to those women in the 1800s and 1900s. So
Who did fight for that? And so in a period where you try to take it personally, where it's like, okay, I don't have these opportunities in a period where I feel restricted in some way, is my natural inclination to want to break out from that? I think all of us do. For young men, it's often this trial of adventure or adversity. Why do we love sports? Again, it's the competitive push. It's like, we don't know if we can win, but we're going to try anyways.
Right.
And I think that is natural. It's not just for men, but for women, we've seen that play out through history. It is this fight for just something else. The question is that something else always good? And that's the question which we have to ask as a society, because I say no, progress is not always actually progress.
Yeah.
And so in other words,
Change is not
change is not
progress.
progress.
yeah.
I wish that Alfred North Head White quote or whatever from earlier.
Yes.
I really enjoyed that one. And yeah, I'll have to find it again sometimes. But yeah, it's a question I want to ask the audience right now is, I think, twofold. First, when you hear the word equal, you hear the word equal opportunity, write down on a piece of paper, what are the words that you associate with those terms? Is it, like Riley said, equal value? Is it differences but complementary roles? Is it just the opportunity to pursue the same thing? Is it more equity in that you should have the exact same talents and abilities and position and lifestyle and cars and family and everything like that? Or is it something different? And so this is something that you have to grapple for with yourselves on what does it mean to be equal in a society that we know there are inequalities. And not all inequalities are bad, in my opinion, where the modern kind of cultural sense is that all inequalities are bad. All inequalities need to be kind of forced out of a system of so-called oppression. And I just don't see a grasp of reality for that sense. So utopian ideas might still exist, but is that a reality that we want? So that is first wave. We see suffrage. Ella agrees. Yeah, having the opportunity to be able to come to a school like this, to be able to express her ideas online over a podcast like this, it's something which is very freeing. And so then we do see, though, where Riley disagrees more, as I've talked to him, is this fight against the cult of domesticity, if I could pronounce that right.
Yeah.
With how G.K. Chesterton, which I'll not steal your thunder, but he writes something very different. So during the time, people like Virginia Woolf all were writing about fighting against this domestic lifestyle, saying that it was restraining them from what should be theirs. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, not my thoughts, Chesterton's, because I think, it's not just women's suffrage and women entering the workplace is not just happening in the United States at this time. It's happening in pretty much the entire Western world, because at the time the British Empire is still massive and has, obviously the European powers have left a lot of ideological influence on all the places they've touched. And so Chesterton, even though today he's regarded as primarily a theologian, he's also a philosopher and a journalist, which he says regrettably. I hate the word, which is very, very funny. But he was talking about how he has all these wonderful quotes because he was one of the first people to come out and say that feminism is not a good thing for us. And he's saying this during the first wave. And so in past years, like 30 years ago, people threw Chesterton away because he comes off as bigoted and mean. And now that we're sort of seeing some people are coming around to the conclusion that maybe this whole feminism thing isn't working out, because there's this interesting Yale study, I believe, which is that...
Stay tuned for more results on that.
Yes.
But it does shed a light on how, again, what's the objective of feminism? Is it to make women happier? Mm-hmm. The study might change your thoughts on that.
If feminism was to make women happier, then I don't think it succeeded. But the best Chesterton quote, he has tons of quotes on feminism, but the very best is when he says, feminism is the muddled idea that women are slaves when they serve women are free when they serve their employers, but slaves when they help their husbands. And so he's saying that there's nothing that is intrinsically better about going to work in the economy and the market. And so he's not really addressing suffrage yet, because that comes a little later in Britain. But he's addressing the idea of women entering the workforce. And he's saying that's not necessarily, there's nothing, he said, I wouldn't wish what I do upon other people because I hate doing it. And he talks about how when women are at home, they are the queens of their own world. And they are the ones who decide everything that goes on. They can be as artistic as they like. They set up all the house how they like. They're, chasing kids around the house. And they're ruling with an iron fist in some sense, is what he's saying. But he's saying that men have to go and act as serfs. He's saying women are despots or kings or rulers or queens. And he's saying that men are serfs. Men have to go and serve underneath someone else and slave away and lose all of their time and energy and vigor for life, because this is after the very beginning of industrialization. And he's saying that I wouldn't wish that upon other people. And what he's insinuating is that the feminist movement actually has a subconscious pretense, which is that feminism is saying that everything that men do is actually better than everything that women do, so we have to allow women to do it. Mm-hmm. And what he's saying is that's not true at all. And he said the business of homemaking is actually, if anything, better than going and working in the economy.
Yeah. And I think just to add on that, I think it's an apt time to mention the quote that men are pigs, perhaps, but modern feminism tells women to get right in the mud with them. So, yeah, think about that. I think you made a great point. Is why do we put value of work over home kind of lifestyle nowadays? Is it something that is inherently better about kind of challenging yourself in a workplace environment versus challenging yourself at a home? Or is it purely this spatial orientation? Do we value things where we're more at movement, I guess, than fixed in one location as being somehow better or more valuable?
Yeah. And the reason he comes down so hard on it and so hard on feminism is because what he says over and over again is that family is the institution that pre-exists civilization. It pre-exists the state and it pre-exists culture. So the family is the most important unit, and we should be protecting it. Not just the nuclear family as in mom and a dad and kids, but as in like a greater, living with extended relatives and that sort of thing, because that was common for most of world history until we start to hit modernity in the 1600s, let's say. But he's saying that family is the most important institution, and anything that goes against family, anything that goes against the idea of the familial relationship and building souls, is not a good thing. And this is one of his, even though he gets chided as an authoritarian sometimes, being Catholic, of course, that of course people are going to say that, but he comes out and says that if the state is doing anything to interfere with the building of new families or the expansion of the family unit, it's evil and wrong and it needs to not happen. And he comes out very, very hard against feminism because he thinks feminism is undermining the family unit, which is the most important institution in all of society.
That brings up a great question, Ella. Yeah, what do you think about the current divorce rates, the kind of family unit style? Do you think modernity as a whole, with the more flexible relationships, are helping families, hurting them? What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I probably would say that it's been hurting families with how high divorce rates are. I mean, I come from a Catholic family where like divorce just really isn't an option. So I kind of view it as, you work it out, and like if something's wrong, you figure it out and you stick with the person. And so I don't know. I think that I agree with Riley, the hitting on family and how it's so important. I don't know. I think with modernity, it has destroyed the family a lot and the sense of family. And there's, I don't want to, but, the government is kind of making decisions that parents should be making now is what you kind of see. And so I think that's not just feminism, but that's kind of how we see, like you guys said, change isn't always progress, and progress isn't always good.
Okay.
So
Yeah, to flesh that out a bit, would you say the government is directly influencing families to say, okay, you guys don't need to be together, kind of you can raise your child by itself, and they're supporting that? Or are you mentioning like education and everything else the government stepping into?
probably a little bit of both. Definitely, we talk about education a lot in Montana state politics, but talking about how the government kind of goes in that way. But I do think that when you open it up to allow the chance of when you make it regular, it makes more people want to do it, I guess. Like get divorced, that type of thing.
I guess it's almost this comparison with your neighbors. Like if everyone else is doing it, then how can it be wrong? And it's easier to justify.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would say that the first wave of feminism got right is that the first wave of feminism was deeply tied with the ideas of sexual abuse at home and how women weren't allowed to divorce. Now, I think no-fault divorce is probably one of the worst mistakes Western civilization ever made. But it's important to remember the context in which it's happening, because the Western part of the world has largely, it was Catholic up until the 1500s, and after the 1500s, Protestants still hold on to, obviously, a lot of Catholic views, and one of them is divorce. Now, the Catholic Church's official position on divorce is that it's not allowed, I don't think ever. But the Eastern Orthodox position, which the Eastern Orthodox split off in, I don't know, 1,000?
Yeah, about
something like that.
Yeah, like 1,200 or 1,100. Yeah,
something like that. But the Eastern Orthodox position has been that, divorce is really bad and we shouldn't do it except in circumstances of sexual sin. So adultery is pretty much the big one, but also in a more modern view, sexual abuse and that sort of thing. You can't do that. And, I've seen this in my own life. Some of our best friends' family had a really super abusive father, and they ended up divorcing, and it's been very good for that family. Even though I think divorce is a horrible thing, they're not in danger of almost dying every day. They're all pursuing wonderful careers and wonderful life. But I think it's important to remember that, winding back to original first wave feminism, this was sort of the position in the West, that divorce is always 100% never allowed, which is why they did sort of have a point about, that's how the temperance movement comes about, is like these men are going out and drinking and they're beating their wives when they get home, which is an awful thing, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And so feminism was tied in with that when it was happening, especially in the 1900s.
And it gained so much support, which showed it was very real. It was an evident problem.
The other thing about the suffrage movement, which I'm going to go back to bashing feminism, but the suffrage movement, because when it was happening, it was extraordinarily unpopular even among women. Exact same thing with World War I and World War II. Our involvement in World War I was deeply unpopular all the way through the end. In World War II, our involvement was unpopular all the way up until Pearl Harbor happened. And then, finally, the American public shifted to a majority being in favor of the war. And so I think it's important to remember that the way feminism happened was not because it was the majority of women asking for it. It was because it was a cultural movement, particularly inspired by certain women who had gotten to high positions of political power. Like, is it Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or is it the other one who ran for Frederick Douglass on a presidential ticket?
Frederick.
It was in her book. So that was 3 weeks ago. I was a lot more quiet during our week on feminism because it was on Zoom, but if it was in person, I would have been in it.
Let's see. Co-runner. You guys can keep on discussing while I try to find it.
Yeah. So anyway, even the first wave feminism movement is deeply affected by the power structures in place, and I sort of subscribe to. I don't subscribe to any particular political philosophy, but one school of thought that I've been influenced by is Machiavellian school of thought. And the Machiavellians argue, Machiavelli himself and also other ones like Sorel and Pareto, are pointing out that power is essentially top-down, not bottom-up. And the reason these changes happened were not because the vast majority of people wanted them. They happened because there was a movement with power that wanted it to happen, whether or not they were a majority or minority. And the primary strain of thought in Machiavellian political thought is that the organized minority will always beat the disorganized masses. That's their rule of political philosophy. So.
Okay. And yeah, so Susan B. Anthony.
Okay.
Is
the way more obvious one.
Not Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yeah. For some reason, that name just sticks more from like AP US history in high school. That's good. So yeah, we see then from first wave to second wave, where topics of reproductive rights become more dominant. We see the introduction of the Equal Rights Amendment as a possibility, which would be number 28. And we also see, what's very curious, is this kind of woven in neo-Marxist ideas, where women no longer are treated as their own sex, but now as a social class. And that is where we see the shift into the kind of 20th century, the 21st century, of this us versus them mentality. It's no longer us women wanting rights, but it's us hating men, or it's the women hating men because they're that different social class. They're the bourgeoisie, we're now the proletariat. And where does that lead you? It leads you right back into the absolute dustbin of hell, as Riley says in the past, of the Marxist thought. And
I said that about atheism,
and
not Marxism, for the record. But
that is true.
atheists know how I feel about them. So
I guess I'm expanding this usage. There we go.
It's good.
Yeah, and also creating women-only spaces. And this is a real kicker, because we see here in modern educational places, safe spaces, women-only spaces, other spaces.
BIPOC-only spaces.
You can see that just because perhaps they've been marginalized in the past, they now deserve special treatment. And the question is this a pendulum which is just swinging back and forth, trying to achieve the state of equilibrium of so-called equality? No, because power tends to create this space of, okay, whoever has power is going to run with it as long as they can. And then once that power gets used up, kind of like your car running on gasoline, it's going to die. And then the pendulum's going to swing back the other direction. And this force tends to just repeat itself. So the creation of these spaces is, I think, the most just straightforward realization of the switch of the pendulum. We're now seeing unequal treatment for a specific group of people. If you had men-only colleges nowadays, which perhaps there's still some somewhere,
handful here and there.
a handful here and there, it becomes very hard to justify in today's society. Whereas if you have women-only colleges, that is very much praised by general media. It's praised by educational awards. They're praised as having a very diverse group of progressive thinkers, and you have to just smile and wave at that group.
Smile and wave, boys. Smile and wave.
Yeah. And so I'm not imposing that idea of you should look negatively upon them, but I want to ask you, does that seem like something that feminism, if it truly stands for equal opportunity and rights and power, is that something that is creating, or is it something that's moving beyond feminism in the definitional sense?
Well, I was in theology class the other day, and my professor said the funniest thing. He was like, I was talking to a student, and he said, the thing is that we're talking about all this like victimizing stuff, and like I'm a white male. There's nothing that I can say that like I can be a quote unquote victim of because, and I just thought that was so hilarious because I mean, it's kind of true, right? Like you can't complain about anything. You can't victimize yourself when you're a white male because it's like, oh, well, so-and-so has so much harder. You guys have always been,
spoon-fed, so
yeah,
much fatter,
right. And so I think that there is the pendulum shift, and it almost makes me wonder if like we saw the definition of like all genders, like maybe it. I guess I don't understand it to be feminism, but maybe it's just I think no one's gonna be happy. At the end of the day, no one's gonna be happy with what happens. The males are getting special treatment; they're higher than us, and then females, then the pendulum swings and females are getting praised in classrooms while males are getting put on ADHD meds, right? Like you're just getting this huge pendulum swing, and I never think we're gonna hit in some equilibrium state because it's just like we're just human. We're never satisfied. Humans aren't perfect, so we're not gonna find some perfect. So I guess maybe that's why I like political science, because it makes me be able to complain about it and talk about it, because nothing's ever going to be perfect. So
what's more perfect than a politician who complains, yeah, talk about butter and toast on that. But yeah, that might kind of open up this broader topic of then sliding in Christianity here. Yes, you aren't going to find happiness in any personal power and any social status and any opportunities on this earth. But we collectively agree that Christianity is the answer. And so again, listen to episode 4, We Found the Meaning of Life. We again, just reiterate this because it is woven into the crux of the matter. It is that cross. And we do agree that there is something just so wholesome and so self-sacrificing of it that we can't compare. And so, yeah, it does make you wonder. If you are in the non-sacrificial position, then maybe you need to recheck your victimizing mentality or your kind of assertions. Are you sacrificing daily?
Yeah, and I think the thing about bringing Christianity into it as well is that the reason that we believe it is because it's true. And because it's true, it will give us better insights into why humanity acts the way it does. And I think that because true things are things that are in accordance with reality, I think that, Christianity obviously has a lot to bring to the political. And this is one of those places where Christianity has a lot to say about what the role of men and women are. And you can go back to, the garden and what happens immediately after the first sin. There's been so much analysis and so much ink spilled by so many people who are so much smarter than me and you and Ella about what exactly is going on in the garden. And there's other places like Paul's letters, obviously, where we get some certain idea, and there's through the whole biblical narrative, you can see the undercurrent of what humanity is about. And so I think one thing we could talk about after we get done talking about the waves of feminism is how does the Christian worldview sort of affect how we view feminism and modernity?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think moving around to the third wave then, we see now this influence of postmodern thinking. And postmodern thinking, in a nutshell, let's erase all boundaries, let's create the boundless mentality, as we previously discussed, the limitless, and just kind of proceed accordingly. And so there's no kind of looking at the warning signs along the road. It's really just full steam ahead, be postmodern. And so now we see this very unique in the mid-1990s return of the so-called very effeminate clothing. You see very suggestive clothing, which is meant to represent women's liberation. So prior, during the civil rights era, it was very covered up. Let's look like men. Let's cut our hair short. Let's do all this. Really, it switched right back and saying, okay, now the sexual revolution has begun. And with that, we now see even this more demonization of men. Now we have toxic masculinity. If men look at us with lust when we dress with basically like 4 inches of fabric on, then they're the pigs. We see a victim mentality because it's very easy to complain in that. And I'm saying both sides are at fault. We definitely want to be sympathetic for those who have been victims of sexual abuse, for those who have experienced that. And both things can be true at the same time. You can not, and taking the words of Ben Shapiro, which I know Riley has less positive opinions on it, but if you're going through a high crime neighborhood and you're waving around your wallet like, hey guys, I have $100 bills here, and you're walking through this neighborhood, do you really think that's a smart decision when there could be a thug to mug you around every corner? Or do you think that's very smart to carry a briefcase and cover it very discreetly and really run through that neighborhood? Same thing with this so-called sexual revolution. If you're looking for trouble, you will find it. And we want to acknowledge that the fault is not with the person who has gone through those experiences, but the decisions have consequences. And so we want to just put that out there. And you can disagree with me, both of you, or
no, you're right.
See what.
Yeah.
No, opinion? Yeah.
No, yeah, I think I'd have to agree with that as well. I mean, yeah, you know, if you're really I don't want to say if you're asking for it because, you know, that's what everyone says is like, that's so horrible. But, you know, I really love the example that you said, if you're in a bad neighborhood, waving your wallet, it's probably not the smartest idea. And I think the also problem is like, it's hard to define the line of like, you know, if you have an employer or a male that you're around often, like, when does it technically become like sexual abuse? Like the line is so like blurred, I guess, you know, everyone has a different opinion of like where that line is, like when it crosses that line, or if like, you know, that you've crossed the line or not, right? I could take something as being totally inappropriate, sexual abuse, and to someone else, another female, it's like, no, that's, the line is much further than what you have said.
Yeah. Well, we can get the obvious one out of the way, right? So, like, there's this video going viral earlier this year of this girl wearing literally, basically a bikini in a gym, and she's, like, lifting weights, and she's saying, oh my gosh, this guy is looking at me. First of all, he looks at her, like, 3 times, like, really quickly, and he doesn't dwell on it or anything. He just walks by, and then she, like, has heavy weights, and he asks if she needs any help, which is just common. That's just gym hospitality. That's what you're supposed to do. And she's sitting there whispering, oh my gosh, it's so effing creepy and everything. And she rightfully got flamed for it on the internet because you are dressing literally as provocatively as you possibly can. And this guy like looked at you.
I'm guessing she was filming this too.
Yes.
Exactly.
But stop bringing your filming equipment to the gym.
But yeah, it does really show the third wave in a nutshell. So we see really, if you think about the sexual revolution, the return of this effeminate idea, but now treating men more demonized and kind of all the pieces that play a role there. And then finally, the fourth wave. And so the fourth wave is somewhat disputed. A lot of scholars now agree it exists, but what I've found from my reading, and this is what I'm least familiar with, is that it's created more gender theorists per se, not as many activists. So one of the articles I was reading by an academic paper is saying that most activists are still third wave feminists, most gender theorists are now this new fourth wave. But I would argue that as we see in a lot of sports nowadays in different academic situations, that's not exactly true, because this fourth wave is trying to erase all biological, physiological, psychological, and social differences between men and women. So as we earlier discussed, how can gender both exist as a fluid idea, but then not exist at the same time? And academics will try to somehow make that piece fit in a puzzle which is constantly shaping and somehow quantumly entangled at the same time. So it takes some pretty crazy physicists to work that out.
Well, because they say with their mouth one thing and they think another. Because, as it turns out, male and female differences are intrinsic to humanity and will never ever undo it, because that's how all biological creatures are coded, but especially us. And so we can pretend, not just pretend as in dress up, but we can actually have males perform female roles, mutilate their body to be somewhat look like a female, and even act like a female. They perform every possible female role in every paradigm, and males try to perform every possible role in a female paradigm, but we can tell that something is wrong because it's anti-nature.
And so also something that left was doing is taking very unique circumstances or very small situations and trying to amplify it, saying this is common because it exists at all. And so, that's another question I want you to ask is, at what threshold are you willing to accept a premise just because it exists for a few? Gender dysphoria is recognized by the DSMs. And so, if you don't know, the DSMs are the large work of so-called kind of mental disabilities or different psychological diseases according to, I don't know, whatever psychological institutions.
Yeah, it's some big board, but it's basically it's the giant book of psychological cases and rules and all the different types of disorders that the DSM is something that I think everybody in Canada and the United States has been using the DSM for a while. I think Dr. Jordan Peterson has talked about it before. Lots of these sort of new counter-feminists or, fifth wave feminists, so-called, who are really just pre-first wave feminists who are advocating to undo some of the things we've done with feminism. These people will mention stuff like that in DSM.
Yeah. And so, it stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Yep.
If that's not mumbo jumbo, then I don't know what it is, but that is what it is. And so then also biologically, you look at muscles. I mean, where they sit at in a stack determines whether they're male or female. So it'll turn to somehow one biological instance is here, so why not? Men and women can be whatever they want to be. Yes, we want you to critically think as an audience. We don't want to make sweeping generalizations saying that all biological life is perfectly ordered at all times, because we also believe that's a fallen world. And where that fallen world creates discontinuities with the ideal kind of framework of how we go about life is something that we also have to grapple with. It's things we have to think about. And that's what we're here to do, is to discuss these ideas. So, with the fourth wave, we've now seen our current situation. We see every aspect of society get touched in a way that is different, and it's non-traditional, and it makes a lot of us think that something's going on that's weird, and most people say, no, you need to accept it, you need to be affirmative, and a lot of us who want to be kind or who want to just recognize that we have purpose and place in the world can very easily ignore it. And one of the things we want to do here is, again, you can't ignore. You have to address these things. You have to think about these things. Because, again, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And with that, we'll proceed on to Ella. What do you think about the four waves of feminism? Are you agreeing with any in particular? And just hearing from female's perspective,
Female's perspective? Well, I don't know. I think you roped just about the least feminist female to join this show. But
well, look at that. I rolled the dice and got snake eyes.
I don't know. Specifically with the fourth wave, I just think that that's crap. The fact that, women aren't men biologically. Like you said, we're not the same psychologically, and there's differences, but I think those differences is why we need both males and females, because I'm sorry, but a world full of males would just be awful, and what's the fly, the book when they're all
Lord of the Flies?
Lord of the Flies. Thank you. I mean, we saw how that turned out,
That's
right?
your Abigail Adams letter. It's very true.
Yes.
Men are tyrannical.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, a world full of females probably.
You don't get Wonder Woman's Island.
Yeah. So I mean, I just feel like there's a reason why there's both males and females, and it's those differences in thinking which makes having both so important. So I don't necessarily think that one has one has one specific role, because a female CEO, she's going to have different ideas than a male CEO, and it may not be right, it might not be what you always think, and maybe she's not going to be the best CEO, but maybe a male isn't either, right? And I think those differences aren't necessarily weaknesses, but the differences is what bolsters our society, and having these different thoughts and makes it better altogether. But no, biologically, I'm weaker than men. I know it. I'm so much weaker, and that's why there's male sports and female sports, because there's a biological difference. So
That's such a good segue for, I think, what we'll keep as our final discussion of the biblical reasoning or the biblical roles of men and women, and then what we see naturally is how can we be authentic is another term that's thrown around, without lacking something, but also trying to follow biblical roles and where there's gray area in that. But first I want to just mention a few things. Riley, did you want to mention the pink tax? And I can mention the working.
So the pink tax, insofar as I understand it, because this wasn't the part that I researched, but the pink tax refers to an alleged empirical regularity that products targeted towards women are more expensive than products targeted towards men. And so I think I've vaguely heard this argument before. People talk about, well, this is evidence that we live in a patriarchy, sees, because all the products that are for women are more expensive than the products that are for men. Which...
And before you address it, have you heard of this, Ella?
I didn't actually until I Googled it, but then when I saw what it was, I was like, oh, okay. I haven't heard it necessarily, but I could see where it's coming from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the specific word I've never heard, but I've heard this concept, and I've heard this brought up before as an argument. So Landon linked to this paper here, and the key point in the paper is highlighted here. We do not find evidence of a systemic pink tax. Women's products are more expensive in some categories, for example, deodorant, but less expensive in others, example, razors. Further, an apples-to-apples comparison of women's and men's products with the same active and inactive ingredients, the women's variant is less expensive in 5 out of 6 categories. So what this really means is that we live in a matriarchy. No, just kidding.
And so that paper, some could argue, well, you're only looking for what you want to look for. This paper was written by 3 female authors at Cornerstone Research, a reputable place, and it does show how, kind of making these blanket statements like, oh, I walked to the store one day and I saw my women's shampoo bottle was $4.39, and I went to the men's section, which was a 3-in-1 bottle of shampoo, conditioner, body wash, and it was only $3.20. Then somehow I have this pink tax where they're charging me more for the same product. And if it was the exact same product, then you have an actual argument on your hands. But it turns out that if you look over a basket of goods, then products that are targeted towards your demographic are probably going to cost more because they think you'll return to it. So men's razors. Turns out men have to shave more often usually. Razors cost more. Women tend to have longer hair, more hair to shampoo, more hair condition, charges are increased there. So when this paper looked at things holistically, turns out the pink tax is pretty much a myth. And this is actually pretty well researched in the last several years. But this idea of the pink tax is still constantly being kind of just mentioned all over by politicians. And I just want to throw that out there because I think it's another thing. If we just victimize ourselves like, oh, I'm a woman, so society is against me, they charge me more and I get paid less, which that's the next point. Do you get paid less? So this is an article by Forbes, by Karen Agnes Lips, and she's at the Harvard Institute of Politics. The official Bureau of Labor Department shows that median earnings of full-time female workers is 77% of the median earnings of full-time male workers. So this is another very common stat. Women make 77 cents on the dollar for men. So there has to be this systemic, oppressionistic, inequality, yada, yada, yada.
Patriarchy.
The patriarchy, And I've talked to many female peers of my own who genuinely believe that they're going to be making less in the workplace for the exact same amount of work. And the question is, how do they calculate it? So again, if you're taking median earnings, then you have to divide the median earnings of all full-time, year-round working women, Okay, you're dividing that amount, and then you're taking the earnings of full-time year-round working men, and then rounding that to the nearest $100, rounding the women's to $77, and then that's how you get that stat. Which again, you're not taking anything into consideration for what type of work, for how long they're working beyond full-time. And this was something that for the Forbes document or article ended up mentioning, is that men tend to work closer to 40 hours per week, where women were closer to 35. And in that instance, just that 5 hours different tends to equate to about 80 cents on the dollar. So it turns out that things can be a lot closer to so-called equal if you analyze the stats holistically. And so again, as you look out in the world, you can always find something you're looking for. Perhaps we're biased in how we're analyzing this data too, because I want to somehow disprove that women actually aren't oppressed. But if you look at the data, form an opinion of your own, look at the facts, follow the facts. And so those were the main 2 points I want to mention before. Riley, if you have anything before we get into our final discussion on religion and the feminist.
Well, I think specifically in the workplace and in government, the thing about second and third wave feminists is they don't actually want women to be represented 50% to 50% men in every category, in every career. And I think that's ridiculous. What they want is positions of power, obviously. They want 50% of women CEOs, they want 50% of women senators, they want 50% of women judges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do we really want women working on oil rigs out in Texas? No, we don't. We don't want them doing that. Like, that's a bad thing. I don't think 50% of women want to be car mechanics. Maybe 1% of women, who are really cool, by the way. Cars.
They're really...
But, I think it's positions of power and positions of prestige. And I think sort of playing into our theological category, this is one of those things about the vices and wishes that drive all of us, is that I think the ones that people mention all the time, respect, power, money, sex, is like sort of the 4. And I know there's a 5th one that I'm forgetting. But this is one of those, like, yeah, some people just want power. And I think if you wanted an example of this, you could look at, there's this video, I think it's called ABC Q&A, which is an Australian broadcasting service. Okay. And it was Jordan Peterson appearing like 3 years ago on a guest panel, and he's alongside this lady in Australia who I think she wasn't running for prime minister, but she was pretty high up in Australian government, and he confronted her on this exact issue, and she just ignored it and tried to avoid the question, like all politicians do. But I don't think that it would be good for women to work construction or be like a logger, especially logging. Logging is really dangerous. Have some buddies that own a logging company.
Yeah. So yeah, Ella, I don't know if you looked at the document, but what percentage of women do you think are in the U.S. construction workforce? And if you've already seen the stat, don't look at it. You've already seen it.
I already saw the stat. Okay.
So I guess for the audience here who don't know, do you think it's close to 30%? No. Go lower. 20%? No. Again, what percentage of the U.S. construction workforce is made up of women? It's a shocking 10.9%. And of that 10.9%, just about 1%, 60% work in sales and the office. So the actual hands-on part is 40% of that 11% of the entire workforce. Which does make you wonder, do they want equality in all capacity? Is this the feminist idea? We want more women building houses because men are just going to be ruining houses for how they're doing this system. No, you don't see that. And the question is, again, I want you to critically think why. Is it just because power is something that they want? And then if it is, then is that something that should be sought after? Is that something that you think objectively will help women? Because again, the Yale study, which I think we can now get into, is, are women happier with this so-called increased amount of work, with this so-called increased amount of opportunity in the workforce, of becoming CEOs, of becoming presidential candidates, of becoming just Nobel laureates, of becoming Nobel Prize winners, of everything under the sun? Is this making women happier? And the Yale study, which we'll probably link in our podcast description, and if this is going on YouTube in the description below, then you can click on it, look down. Happiness is declining for women relative to men as they are increasing their role and kind of overall proportion of power in the workplace. So again, that's a question of why. And the paper does a great job at disconnecting it from divorce rates of different relationships, of different specific cultural, societal problems of race, of different factors that might skew that data. They try to keep it very objective. For men and women in the workplace over time, happiness is not being very much improved. So again, the question is why?
I think one thing that would be relevant to mention is like what is the ultimate goal of feminism, right? Is it for women to be as happy as men? Because if that's the goal, it didn't work. If the goal is for equality, it's mostly worked, which makes you wonder, well, what should we be aiming towards? And to turn back to Chesterton, because he has a wonderful quote about this, it's a quote about all the popular modern phrases and ideals. So this is him calling an audible here. So I'm just going to read it real quick. Every one of the popular modern phrases and ideals is a dodge in order to shirk the problem of what is good. We are fond of talking about liberty, that, as we talk of it, is a dodge to avoid discussing what is good. We are fond of talking about progress. That's a dodge to avoid discussing what is good. We are fond of talking about education, which is also a dodge to avoid discussing what is good. The modern man says, let us leave all these arbitrary standards and embrace liberty. This, logically rendered, means let us not decide what is good, but let it be considered good not to decide it. He says, away with your old moral formulae, I am for progress. This, logically stated, means let us not settle what is good, but let us settle whether we are getting more of it, which I think that plays into the feminism part very heavily. He says, neither in religion nor morality, my friend, lie the hopes of the race, but in education. This, clearly expressed, means we cannot decide what is good, but let us give it to our children.
Yeah, that is good. Especially the education one, not one I often think about is we think enlightenment or all these so-called lofty ideals are going to help us kind of pursue the good.
And tying it back to the biblical worldview, it's not that wisdom is a bad thing. In fact, Solomon said we should seek out wisdom, but he also warns us about it ahead of time. With much wisdom and with much knowledge comes much suffering. And it's not, you're not getting a clean deal. You're not getting a car for free, you know? It costs $25,000 and you're going to have to make payments over it for 3 years, you know? When we make these bargains and these deals to get something we want, the problem is that most of the things we want are not God. God is the only thing that we can want, that there is no downside to it. Because in the end, all good flows from God and all love flows from God. Even the most pure relationships on the planet, you're still getting a few bad things here and there out of it. Now, obviously, something like having kids is a wonderful thing and a massive upside. But it's not like there's not material concerns. Obviously, it costs money. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of your time away. And, you know, if there's 2 parents in a household, there's not enough time in the day for both of you to be working without hiring a babysitter or something. And that costs even more money. And so it's just important to remember that every time we make a trade for something, either in our own personal lives on the day-to-day or as a society, we are not going to get everything we want out of it. There are always unforeseen consequences, both positive and negative.
And the question is, how do we remedy those with whatever lifestyle we're trying to pursue, if we're trying to pursue the good or if we're just trying to pursue power aspirations? It is this, balance. That's good. Yeah, Ella, anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't want to damper on what you just said, Riley. So
Thank you.
Yeah,
that's good. So I think for our last transition here to the biblical understanding of the role of men and women, where feminism fits into it, we come from, I think, generally more traditional biblical interpretation here. I actually just wrote a paper on the Apostle Paul on Christian women for my theology class, and so I have a little more education with Paul's understanding in Greek, and then we can kind of see, Riley, you're more specific with Old Testament, which I think is also helpful for this conversation to kind of balance it too, because you mentioned Ezekiel.
We were talking about it earlier, and I don't think it's Ezekiel, but it's before, it's right in the last couple kings of Judah. So Israel has already been conquered by Assyria, and what happens to 10 of the tribes of Israel? They fade away into history and they don't exist. But Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, their last couple kings, they're not great if you have read the Bible before. But one of the punishments that is listed, curiously, is that you will be led by women and young children, or women and babes, depending on the transition. And so that makes you wonder, wait a minute, why would it be bad for people to be led by women and essentially young men or little children? Why would that be a bad thing? And so the reason I was talking about the Old Testament's connotation is that you go all the way back to the garden and you can see that they already have different rules right off the bat. They're instituted by God. And interestingly, the curse of the fall, which is sin, which Jesus undoes, right? So there's veins of theology within Christianity that insinuate, okay, male and female differences did not exist before the fall. After the fall, they exist, but now that Jesus has come and died and resurrected again in accordance with specific prophecies, that we, as Christians, we are freed from it. But it's one of these things where you go back to the garden and some of these commands and some of these curses are not yet rescinded while we're here on an earthly planet. So just as a different example, fill the earth and subdue it. That is never, ever revoked in the entire Bible. That's not, it's never revoked. So it's still our job to do that. And men and women sin, like Christian men are still farmers, Adam, you must toil with all your sweat and energy, toil in the fields. And then, if male-female differences were eliminated because Jesus took care of sin for us, then you would be able to go to a children's hospital and figure out which ladies are Christians and which ones aren't. But as it
no
turns
child
out,
pain.
They're still suffering from it. And there's the other interesting part of it, which is that you will seek to rule over your husband. And I think that feminism is that to a T. And it's not that feminism is solely responsible for where we're at in modernity. I'm hardly saying that. But feminism is one of the many expressions of modernity. Now that we've moved on past Christianity and using the Enlightenment, and we use reason as the highest standard, but then we sort of start to forget that, like, what is the whole point of humanity and why are we here? And as you would say, to know God and to make Him known. And like I say, there are 3 jobs you have as a Christian. You become more like Christ, you help other Christians become more like Christ, and you spread the word to people who don't already have it. It's literally your job. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't think that the Christian worldview can permit that men and women are exactly the same, because they're not, and because they do different things. And I think that, if we were to get, let's say feminism has a total victory, and let's say we have a female president, and we have like a 50-50 cabinet, male-female, and all the generals are 50-50, male-female, and then you get down to the army, this is where it would just be so obvious. Like, okay, every other career, yeah, let's say women can be CEOs and everything. Then we get in the army. Any country that would send women to die in a war is the most brutal and low of any country that has ever existed.
Yeah.
Because
as a modern feminist, you're like, whoa, no, men and women are equally. We now support selective service.
Yes.
And you're right. Well, it's like, why in our minds do we still see
why do we draw the line there?
Very valuable about keeping women alive, and men, there's something that sacrifices kind of innate in them to protect.
Yes.
Right? That protection.
When you look at it, when you look at all the great people of history, they're almost overwhelmingly men. All the great kings in both the Bible and the secular kings, Darius and Cyrus, and every single king of Israel was a man. And depending on, there's a lot of difference in age. Josiah was king when he was 8, and there were certain kings that didn't become king until they're in their 50s. But, you look at Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. You look at all these people and you're like, why? Obviously there are exceptions. There's, what's her name from Russia? The queen.
Catherine the Great.
Yeah, Catherine the Great.
Mm-hmm. So I would say Joan of Arc, Catherine the Great.
Catherine the Great, Joan of Arc. They're like little exceptions to the rule here and there. But 99.999% of all the great heroes of history are men. Yeah. But there's also this other element that you can't forget it, is that that's not what makes someone valuable in God's eyes. Mm-hmm. That's not, being a warrior is not what makes you valuable in God's eyes. And it's like women have a specific wonderful thing, which first of all, they're the crown of beauty in all creation. That's what they are, and it's said in the Bible, it's very specific. And that they bring something to men that men cannot do themselves, because men are way too rough around the edges. And it's good, this is the other thing about the discussion sort of coming around in marriage. When Paul talks about it, he says, I wish that you were all like me in celibate. What does that mean? Is he rescinding God's command that everything in the garden, God had made everything, no sin had happened yet, and he said it was not good for man to be alone. So he had to make woman, and he had to make Eve. And when you look at it, are you saying is Paul rescinding that? No. What he's saying is, because some of you are prone to sexual sin, it would be better for some of you if you had the urge to do so taken away. But because most of you still have the urge to do so, it would be good for husbands to take wives and wives to take husbands. Why? Because that is still part of our job, fill the earth and subdue it. It's still part of our job that the way we make more people, more Christians who are out there warring in the world, we don't have that much time, 120 years tops, most of us 70. We can't fix everything about our world by ourselves. And one of the fundamental realities of the human experience is that you are born in community and humans are social creatures. This is why I think that as bad as communism is, it views people as it's the complete opposite of individualism. And because we live in the West, we believe individualism is good. And we already know what communism does. Communism takes away the individual entirely and reduces you to being part of a group. But Ayn Rand, individualism, that's literally the Satanic Church's motto. Do as thou wilt. You have no tie to anyone else. And that's not where the biblical narrative comes down. Actually, as it turns out, you're not something that evolved from a fish. As it turns out, you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you're not just made that way in a vacuum. You're actually made that way, and you're born to your specific time, in your specific civilization, to your specific family for a reason. And you have ties to these people. And even within the world's framework, how does God characterize his relationship with us, with the church? As a family. That's how he characterizes it. Yeah. We are sons of God. That's what we become. And so you will never, ever do what modern liberal democracy does, which is probably the biggest knock I have against it. I'm not really pro any specific system, and I haven't driven myself in any camp. But it needs to be said that democracy is not individualism, total and utter individualism, responsible to no one, living in a vacuum, and living for hedonism. That's not a good thing. And the way liberal democracy is not ordered in accordance with what the biblical narrative is. And I think this is one thing that's really important to do, is you have to be able to take yourself outside of the environment and the system you've been living in, and you can't evaluate things as that's mean or that's nice or that's I like that's racist, that's sexist, that's good, that's something we should promote, that's based, that's cringe, whatever. That's not how you should evaluate anything ever. The only way you should evaluate whether you are going to do something or not is whether it's true or false. And if it's true, then it can be good. And if it's true and good, then it can be beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, mic drop. Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, we wouldn't want to drop that. We'd break it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there and so much for future episodes to really kind of continue on with. But for sake of time, I think to wrap it up, we see, the differentiation of roles with men and women from the garden. We see men not good to be alone. We have women as a helper, but not to be in subjugation, but to be this companion with. There's this great analogy of this opposing force that keeps you steady. And with that, we see the New Testament, as I've written in my essay, where some would argue, well, women submit to your husbands. Or some translations might not say women who are married. In Ephesians, it says husbands, but in Corinthians, it ends up just saying like women, which there's no Greek differentiation. I think it's gynekos for women and married women. So then there's all these little nuances. But taking away the nuances, thinking big picture, are we acting like Christ? Because again, what's that one point? We're trying to become more like God, trying to become more like Christ by following in that path. And with that, if you have the leadership authority, just like you're leading a platoon, as I would be a second lieutenant in the Army, I'm going to be leading a platoon. I have authority over them. But am I going to be subjugating them and making them my slave drivers and abusing them because I have that authority and I have that capacity? No. I'm going to be bending over backwards to try to pick them up, to lead them into battle, to protect each one of them, and to hopefully empower them to make their own decisions. That is what men's authority over women is supposed to be biblically, because men are then under Christ. And it's so simple and yet so hard to follow through because we live in a fallen world. We've seen the imperfections that people around us show, and so we want to hold on to that power. We want to have control over our lives, but we know that there's a better path, and that path, I think we can safely say, is not feminism. So with that said,
I think just to add on one last little bit to that rant you did, talking about how you would, put your life on your line for your boys, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's the second part of the verse. It's wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives and give yourselves up for them, just as Christ gave himself up to the church, which means
so true.
You are willing to put your body on the line and sacrifice for the greater good. Not for the greater good. I can't believe I just let that slip out. You need to sacrifice for the good of your family, really, and for the good of God's creation. And that's why men are always in these political leadership positions, is because as it turns out, wielding power occasionally means the spilling of blood, and that's not it's not a good thing, but it's like the civil magistrate. Like that's the job. That's why government is instituted on earth by God, is to punish evil things and to promote good things, right? And so coming back around to this male-female discussion, men, love your wives and give yourself up for her as Christ did for the church. This is why when the Titanic sinks, that all the women and children go first, right? That's at the end of the day, because we have certain privileges, it means we also, on top of their privileges, we have responsibilities. And this is one of them. Like, it's our job to go down with the ship. It's our job to lay our body on the line for women and children, and it's our job to lead, And I think that's one of the most important dynamics that the modern world fails to grasp.
Absolutely, yeah. Before we wrap up, Ella, want to finish us off with anything?
You really don't think that women can lead in any sense?
Not in any sense. No, not in any sense.
But it's the male's role to lead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at home, if we look at the domestic world, I think that it's women sort of lead at home. But, when you look at in the public sphere, I don't think it's right for women to wield authority over men, because it's not. You might be able to make the argument that, okay, it's not that men should be in authority all the time from the biblical text. But nowhere in the biblical text does it say it is good for women to be wielding authority over men, which is telling. That's not there anywhere. In fact, you can find verses that say the exact opposite. Now, obviously, if you come in with an agenda when you're reading the text, you can make it say sort of whatever you want, because even Satan knows the scriptures, and even Satan can take the word of God and twist it. But if you come in with an open mind and heart, and you're able to evaluate, this is a great Curtis Yarvin quote, how you evaluate from outside of yourself, outside of the time and place that you are in. He says that the way you do this, he gives a thought example. So suppose you were a 15th century Catholic in 15th century Spain. You're Catholic, all your friends are Catholic, your parents are Catholic, every institution you have ever been to is Catholic, you've only read Catholic books, you go to Catholic schools, your entire nation is Catholic. You're aware that there are people who aren't Catholics, but how did Catholics in 15th century feel about the Turks, or about what Protestants, how Protestants treat their wives? Yeah. So, or pagans for that matter in Europe. And so you're aware that you're not aware of the fact that everything you view is through 15th century Spanish Catholicism. And if in the modern version of you were able to talk to 15th century version of you, there would be some mixed up understandings, and you'd be like, wait, what? Your civilization does this? What? You do this? It'd be weird. And so you have to be able to evaluate that as of 2024, living in the United States, the world you've grown up in, the United States has been bathed in feminism since at least 1900. We got over 120 years of it, and so it would be hard to go back and read someone like Aquinas or Augustine, and they're, the church fathers and, Catholic thinkers and Protestant thinkers, even later, people like Charles Spurgeon and stuff like that, and you can even look at Eastern Orthodoxy, they actually all held to a very specific view of what the male and female role is. And the reason that it might be offensive in some way for me to say that I don't like when women are wielding authority over other men is because it's out of time and space. It doesn't feel right, so to speak, to say that sentence in 2024, as a straight white male in America, blah, 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 all the other historical context. I'm not saying strip everything of historical context, but the way we should evaluate ideas and statements and what we believe about the world is solely, or at least first and foremost, on the basis of whether things are true or false. And so I think if you started to put 50-50 women or only women in positions of authority across the board in society, it would not be a good thing. Even 50-50, even 25-75. Even look at the quality of leadership we have compared to the 1940s, say. Is anyone in government today, is Kamala Harris, is Joe Biden, is Susan Rice, is anybody even mildly comparable to someone I disagree with a lot, FDR or Woodrow Wilson or LBJ? No, people in our government leadership positions and at soulless corporate boards are just less impressive than the people who lived 100 years ago. And I think that that's at least partially due to every time you loosen up the criteria, obviously the quality is going to go down. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be, there's always people who are out, that's always a thing. There's always going to be some random person who's like 170 IQ, and no matter how the system is stacked against that person, they're going to rise to the top. Or someone is so charismatic or so good at statescraft, like Catherine the Great, that even in her time and place, when it was unheard of for a woman to lead a country, she was so competent that there's no problem with it. Yeah. But speaking in generalities, I think men are better at leading.
Okay. And I'd put up the condition that we can't put God in a box in where he wants to move. Say with Esther, like with Mordecai, it's like who would have Esther become the queen? Well, that was God's will. And so trying to trap it into like this is set in stone and there's no room for flexibility of women leading, I think is limited. But to know that if we're trying to push an agenda or trying to push something that tries to conflict with it, then we need to reevaluate and discern and seek guidance from the Holy Spirit for that.
Right. So, I'm not an absolutist in any way. I definitely think there's wiggle room. I'll just give you an example. At national, I love Carrie Lake at a national level. She's far more competent than most people in the Republican Party. So, like, if Carrie Lake was going to run for president, I would make an exception because I think she's a highly competent, very intelligent person.
Arizona Sally didn't think so.
But, well, maybe they did.
Maybe.
Anyway.
Well, we thank you, Ella. Maybe I can get right, Kuenzli.
Yes.
Let's go! Yeah. And for joining us on this very special episode. We enjoyed your input. Thank you, Riley, for again delivering the bars. And yeah, I think we enjoyed having episode 11 with you guys here listening. It's been a month and a half since our last podcast episode. We don't know if we'll get another one done before the break, which is coming up quickly in about 2.5 weeks. So yeah, if there's any ideas you want us to discuss beforehand, please email us, write in the comments or whatever. If you have any concerns, any comments, any overall crazy rants and enjoyment.
Anything you want to say to us, especially this episode, if you want to say nice things about Ella and give me hate mail, then you can email us at cruxofthematterpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes.
And also during the long break, I wrote a shorter Substack article than the last one. It's called Christ or Chaos, The Right and Permanent Things, Nietzsche, Power, and the Problem of the Political.
It's such a good article. You got to check it out.
Yeah. And you can find that on our Substack, which is thecruxofthematter.substack.com, or you can go to my Twitter handle, which is TunaRJS, and I have it linked. So
awesome. And Ella, any social media or anything you want to plug?
Anybody you want to shout out?
Yeah.
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Well, Riley, want to close us out?
I'm Riley Stansberry.
And I'm Landen Connor. This has been Crux of the Matter. See you guys next time.